Well, hey everybody. My name is David Perez, and I am the lead minister of Spero Day, this very unique church that is rethinking and reimagining a different kind of spirituality. We actually think Christianity needs to change and transform and evolve. Now, if you hang around any echoes or shadows of Christianity these days, you are hearing lots of talk about deconstruction. And that's a really important conversation, and one we very much have at Spero Day. Have it freely, have it safely. You can say anything what you're deconstructing from. But Spero Day is also a church. We're not just a social media commentator or a social media platform. A lot of those commentators about deconstruction are talking about what they're deconstructing from, what they no longer can hold to. And it's important because it's something that we identify with. So as important is it to us that we can freely and safely have conversations about deconstruction, we're also interested in reimagining and reshaping and reordering our Christian spirituality. Christ is still compelling to us. In a sense, there is a whole new kind of Christianity erupting and happening. And so if you have found us in and through that, I want to say welcome. I know some of you are watching right here in the Nashville area, but others of you are watching in some other city in the United States, in Chicago, in Boston, in Los Angeles, and everything in between. I know folks are watching internationally. Corey and the gang up in Canada. We have folks watching in the UK. We have folks watching down under in Australia, even New Zealand. I've heard from folks who are watching in Europe and in Asia. So wherever you are today, welcome to Spero Day.
Talk about it now. I had my time to think. I'm ready to say the words out loud. Fear has been shrinking 'cause I don't have the time to waste my life worrying about what you think of me. I found myself won't let nothing else give me any reason to doubt again. That should be safest and on me suddenly, but I'm learning to trust again. I have found myself, let nothing else give me any reason to hide again. Hello, it's nice to meet you. I've been hiding for
Okay, so let's just go there. I mean, right off, let's just dive in deep. Let me ask you this question and really ponder this. Who in your life actually holds the power to determine whether you're worthy or whether you're perfect enough or whether you're approved of? Who holds that power in your life? Is it a boss? Is it a spouse or a partner? Is it your parents, even though you're all grown up and mature? Or even though they're dead and gone, is it your parents? Is it some other family member? Is it your spiritual or religious belief? Is it a minister, a pastor, a youth group leader? Is it the faith community that you were part of? Is it God? Is it you? Is it your own inner voice? Who actually holds the power in your life to say you're approved of and you're worthy? You see, too many of us get stuck in this life or get even stuck in our spiritual faith because someone or something holds some sort of approval or validation in our lives. I'm in this series called More Trouble Than It's Worth, and I'm talking about things like our need to control or our need to gain more approval. Today I'm talking about our need to be perfect, to reach a standard. And all of these things, right, we want them or we try to get them, but they're always more trouble than they're worth. They do damage to our soul. So this particular message is going out to all of you perfectionists today. So what is a perfectionist? Well, you already know this. Perfectionism is this innate trait where you give yourself this endless report card. You give it to yourself, you give it to your efforts that you are less than perfect. Perfectionists just strain compulsively towards these unattainable and unrealistic standards by which they then measure their self-worth. And since perfectionists inevitably never achieve perfection, they're forever disappointed, right? They're disappointed in themselves, and they even end up harsh critics of themselves, like a lot. Now, as a minister, I've seen this, but more than that, as a person, you see, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, which means when I'm in my stuff, it means I go to the negative side of a 1. I go to perfectionism. So I've seen how this perfectionistic trait can impact my life, impact my Christian spirituality by thwarting love and peace, by thwarting relational connection that a genuine spirituality should nurture. And Christian beliefs do not make us immune to perfectionism. In fact, I've seen the opposite, a certain kind of Christian belief, the dominant form that we see in the West today, the one that's focused on moral absolutism and biblical literalism, American evangelicalism, Christian perfectionism. It all works towards this personal holyism that just heaps an even bigger, weirder kind of perfection on us. I mean, once you get God involved, it gets really weird. So today I want to look at this interesting passage in the New Testament, and I want to see if maybe we can see about our own perfectionistic tendencies and our own spiritual perfectionistic tendencies. So, as I said, Spero Day is a church that's rethinking Christianity, and we're reimagining a different kind of Christianity. So what I love is I love bringing that rethinking and that reimagining even to the scriptures. At Spero Day, we like to say we take the scriptures so seriously that there's no way we can take them literally. So in searching the ancient scriptures, we're always looking for a deeper nuance that's meaningful to us today. So when it comes to perfectionism, the scriptures don't lay out its psychology per se, not that like we see it today, not like we understand it today, but this trait of perfectionism that's got its hold on humanity at times, it's in these ancient writings. There's even a few perfectionists in the scriptures. King Saul is one of them. We see this in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. It partly ruined him. Let me show you this passage from 2,400 years ago from Ecclesiastes 11:4. Here we see perfectionism. Look what it says. If you wait until the wind and the weather are perfect, you'll never plant anything and never harvest anything. Right there is perfectionism. You see what it's saying. If you wait for perfection, if you wait until conditions are right, or this thing you've created, or this effort you're trying to pull off, if you're trying to wait for it to be perfect, you're never going to get anything done. Some great thing is never going to get started, because it had to be perfect even before it happened. You see, some perfectionists, they fight procrastination, but it's not because they're lazy, hardly. It's because of fear. They fear failure. They fear being less than. And we see this displayed in the Apostle Peter. And so let's look at this. As I show you this, let's reimagine and allow the scriptures to maybe awaken us. And I want to show you this quirky confrontation between Jesus and Peter, who's one of his key followers. Now, before I show you that, let me set up this scene. Jesus is with the 12 apostles, and they're hanging out by the lake. So then Jesus asks, hey, what are you hearing out there? What's the buzz? Tell me what's happening. Who do the people say I am? Who do they think I am? So one of the guys chimes in. He goes, well, they think you're John the Baptist come back to life. And then another one goes, no. They think you're Elijah who's come back to life. Then one of the 12, another one butts in and goes, yeah, I even heard them say that you're Jeremiah who's come back to life. And Jesus goes, wow, really? Well, who do you guys say I am? And without blinking, Peter goes, I think you're the Messiah. I think you're the Son of God. And Jesus is sort of blown away, and he says, wow, Peter, I don't think you could have concluded this based on your own human sense, right? You must be very attuned to a spiritual sense to conclude that, to awaken to that, that I am Christ the Messiah. So I'm going to build my church on you. My church starts with you, Peter. And so now that you've got this set up a bit, I want you to watch what happens right after this amazing scene and see if we can point out some things about perfectionism. Take a look at this at Matthew 16. From then on, Jesus began telling his disciples what would happen to him. He said, I must go to Jerusalem. There the nation's leaders, the chief priests, and the legal experts will make me suffer terribly. I will be killed, but 3 days later I will rise to life. Peter took Jesus aside and told him to stop talking like that. He said, God would never let this happen to you, Lord. Jesus turned to Peter and said, Devil, get away from me. You're in my way because your interests are like everyone else, and they're not the interests of God. So, right there, you can see the perfectionism. You can see it creep into Peter. It's actually quite classic. And in verse 22, Peter took Jesus aside and told him, listen, stop talking like that. God is never going to let this happen to you, Lord. So, right there, Peter drops the God card right into is perfectionism. And once you drop God and mix it with perfectionism, it gets royally messed up. It reminds me of that old Seinfeld joke, where everything gets compared with NASA putting a man on the moon, right? You've heard it, right? Boy, you can put a man on the moon, but they can't make a solar car. You can put a man on the moon, but you can't get a prescription bottle to open easily. Once you drop God in, you have this weird comparison. But before that, Jesus says, before Peter confronts him on that, Jesus says, listen, the leaders, the priests, the legal experts, they're going to make me suffer terribly. Why? Because Jesus' teaching actually holds up imperfection, which is the opposite of the religious leaders' perfect interpretation, their perfect doctrine, their perfect morality, their perfect view of what a perfect pious life is to be. Jesus teaches opposite of that. Jesus talked to everybody. He welcomed everybody, the sinners, the saints. And Jesus taught what authenticates a spiritual life. It's not some perfect pious standard. It's not some perfect doctrine that everyone should believe. It's not a perfect morality that you need to practice. But it's your heart, it's your love, it's how you love with your heart, it's how you serve with your hands, it's how you include with your arms. Those are the ones that Jesus included at his table. So right there, perfection in no way, right from the beginning, perfection in no way is ever woven in to authentic Christian spirituality. In fact, it's imperfection that is heralded. But somehow, perfection snuck back in. It snuck into the historic creeds that we had to swear to. It snuck into the doctrinal beliefs that we needed to define and can never evolve, and we have to believe. And it's snuck in on a moral behavior that we need to keep and pass on. That's why a bunch of us couldn't do it anymore, right? You couldn't do the perfection faith thing anymore. You see, love and mercy and grace, that opened your heart. That made sense to you. That compelled you. But somehow the perfection side, the holiness, the godliness, the absolutes, the biblicism, the rigid, can't evolve faith, that just heaped on a perfectionism that made you suffer terribly. And isn't it interesting that Jesus turns to Peter and he says, you are in my way with that. Your interests are not the interests of God. This scene points out that Peter's reactions, they're just so automatic. They just automatically come. And what science tells us, when our reactions are so reactive, they just come, we have these neural patterns that we've trained ourselves. They're just so automatic. It's like we have this neural rut that we're stuck in and we can't get out of. Now, the good news is scientists tell us that we can undo these neural ruts, these neural patterns, but it takes two things. It takes awakening our awareness, and it takes practicing awakening our awareness. So let me talk about 5 things that we can begin to practice and that we can begin to awaken in our lives that'll help us undo perfectionism in our lives and in our spirituality. So here's the first thing to practice. Practice acceptance of yourself. I want you to remember something. You can't hate your way into accepting yourself. Convincing yourself that you're a failure and that you're never going to make any situation better, or you're bound to just repeat things that are going to foil any potential in your life. It's just not going to work. But when you can begin to wake up your awareness and begin practicing accepting yourself, it transforms you. Here's another interesting thing that happens, and we see this in this scenario with Peter. Peter is just refusing to deal with the reality of the moment. He can't deal with the present. And his coping mechanism for his fears is to insist on some other fiction. He says, Jesus says, listen, I must go to Jerusalem now. There I'm going to suffer terribly now. So what does Peter do? He takes Jesus aside and he says, stop talking like that. God would never let this happen to you. Peter has this perfect view of God, of life. Actually, he has an avoidant view of life and spirituality, but I'll talk about that in a moment. So one of the best ways that we can deal with our perfectionism is that we just begin to practice acceptance, that you begin to wake up yourself, and when you become aware that you're going to judge, you start getting your noticer out, your judging noticer out, your self-condemnation noticer out. You start to notice that and you just shut that down. You become aware and you go, no. I'm practicing. I am enough. I am worthy. I don't have to be perfect. Imperfection is actually what is celebrated in spirituality. Imperfection actually brings those lessons that I need to learn. Imperfection creates a spiritual trust and a spiritual turning to God. So begin to practice acceptance. Okay, so here's another thing we can awaken to. Here's another practice we can awaken to. Make peace with the now. Not only accept it, but make peace with the now. You see, before you're ever going to feel satisfied with the later, you're going to have to be satisfied with the present. So make peace with it. Make peace where you are. Make peace with your journey towards something new. When you make peace and practice that, you just end up feeling more peaceful. It's more rewarding. You feel more satisfied. However, as I was saying about Peter, many times the motive behind perfectionism, it isn't achievement or perfectionism. It's avoidant behavior. It's avoiding failure. This seems what Peter is doing, more than him having to be perfect. When he turns to Jesus and goes, no, this can't happen to you. He actually fears something. So perfectionism is really tethered to anxiety. And so when we awaken more to that reality, when we begin to wake up, get our noticer out, trust ourselves, trust God, and go, you know what? I'm not only going to accept the present, I'm going to make peace with it, however it goes. In a sense, there's a consent. There is a gentle acceptance of it. And when you begin to practice that, perfection goes down less and less and less. It's really a wonderful, wonderful thing. Okay, this third awakening, this third practice, this one is huge. And it's give up the critical voices that come to you from other people. Let them go. There's always going to be critics who are trying to validate your worth. And you see how Jesus responds when Peter is doing that. He says, devil, you're in my way. Peter, you're actually putting at my feet your stuff. And you're saying, Peter, that I should pick up your stuff and carry it as if it's my own. But Peter, that's your stuff, and I'm drawing a boundary. I have my own spiritual interests, and I'm not letting you dictate what mine need to be. No way. And you see, for those of you who want an independent life, for those of you who want to trust your own spiritual life and freedom, there is a price to be paid. And you know what that price is? Other people are going to drop their stuff, their agendas at your feet. And if you have some sort of perfection, imperfection thing that is still tethered to their value of you, it affects you. You still feel your family's disapproval. You still feel a friend who says, what has gotten into you? You still feel your old religious camp saying, I think you're lost. But instead of listening to their words, I would actually listen to the words that Jesus said to Peter. Peter, get that away from me. You and your agenda are in the way of my life and what is actually in the best interest of what is happening to my heart and soul. You're getting in the way of how God is actually awakening me. And when Jesus turns to Peter and says, I need to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die, Jesus understands that life is never perfect. And he understands that a spiritual life doesn't create a perfect life. Now, some of you are looking at me and saying, of course, I get that. I know that. But still, even though you know that, you were still taught that there's a perfect doctrine out there that you're supposed to believe. There are perfect things that you're supposed to hold to. There's a perfect way to live out your spirituality. There are perfect morals that you are supposed to keep. There is a perfect, certain, specific spiritual outlook you are supposed to have. So though you understand life doesn't go perfect, and though you understand there isn't a God who owes you a perfect life, you were still taught there is a perfect way, though, to respond to God with your beliefs and practice. Now, we have words for this. What are they? Holy, righteousness, godly? Well, I don't think so, no. It's more like words like biblicism and legalism and Pharisaic and fundamentalism and moralizer and fanaticism and idolatry. All the things Jesus' spirituality stood opposed to. When Jesus turns to Peter and says, get that away from me, he's demonstrating something that we can use against our own perfectionism, and that's satisficing. Have you ever heard that word, satisficing? That's the fourth thing that we can wake up to. The term satisfice or satisficing, it was coined by the American scientist and Nobel laureate Herb Simon all the way back in 1956. Satisficing, it's a decision-making strategy that you hold within that aims a satisfactory or maximizing result rather than I have to have a perfect solution. You see, Peter needs a perfect result for Jesus. In Peter's spirituality, God is never going to let bad things happen to you, Jesus. But Jesus, the actual founder of Christian spirituality, he doesn't even think that way. So instead of only thinking that your and my efforts, instead of us thinking they need to be perfect and ideal, focus on maximizing. Focus on, I'll be satisfied with them. I'll give my best effort. I'll maximize to the best I can, and I will be satisfied that that is good enough. That's being satisficient. And people who are satisficient, they just live more peaceful. They're much more calm. perfectionists, no, they're always coming up short. So be a maximizer versus a perfectionist. Be satisficient. So finally, here's the fifth practice that we can begin to awaken to. We awaken when we begin to practice this. And it's practice an attuning presence to God, to yourself, to the world around you. Practice this attuning presence to God. And when you do, and to yourself, those are moments of enlargement. When we attune ourselves to God, when we're spiritually centered, suddenly we're bigger. We feel bigger with peace and calm. We actually feel bigger with the experience of enoughness. You feel enough. You do. And when you're at that centered place of enoughness, you don't need to condemn, you don't need to exclude, you don't need to divide or separate, you don't need to determine who's in, who's out. Your whole experience is it all belongs, everything belongs. And this is a deep experience of connectedness, of union. And this is why we feel full and larger. But unfortunately, many of us were sent down these private paths of perfection, which of course none of us could ever achieve. But the path of union, the path of attunement, it's much different than the path of becoming more, the path of spiritual growth. It's much different. The path of union and connectedness, it's about a wholeness with God instead of becoming more, growing into more, becoming godly or holy. That process, this is why I often say that awakening spiritually is better than spiritual growth. And so, because it puts us on an endless path of perfection. This is why so many of you gave up on Christianity, because you go, I can't do it. I can't be perfect. And some of you became practical atheists, practical agnostics. I get it. Why? Because you weren't going to be hypocrites. I get that. You just go, I can't do this perfection anymore, because it robbed you of joy. It robbed you of union and connection. That's what a perfect standard, a perfect doctrine, perfect moralism, this is what it does to us. It always condemns ourselves and always leads us, in a sense, to condemning others. You see, we awaken spiritually much more by doing it wrong than by doing it perfect. Really, that's the central message of Christian spirituality. This is how we awaken, when we understand it's actually through our imperfections that we change and transform, that we learn to trust God deeper, that we learn to trust ourselves more. What a clever place for God to hide himself, than to hide himself not in our perfections, but to hide himself in our imperfections. And when you and I can consciously forgive ourselves and forgive others and include our imperfections and include the imperfections of others, it just transforms us. It's like that old adage is true. The enemy of perfection. You know what? I can't remember that old adage. As I was beginning to recite it, I lost it. So isn't this good? Isn't this good? Right here, I demonstrate demonstrated serious imperfection. Listen, if you can begin to awaken to these 5 practices, if you can actually go, you know what, I'm going to get my noticer out and I'm going to start practicing these things. My gosh, even if you maximize just one of those, you'll see yourself transform. You'll see imperfection decrease. I've been on a long journey of this, probably the last 12, 15 years. And I'm not cured of my imperfection yet. But it doesn't have the kind of control, the kind of anxiety in my life that it used to. Jesus taught a spirituality that's very attuned with reality. Peter's perfectionism spirituality was a spiritualism that was very much focused on super naturalness. And Jesus had a spirituality that's very much hidden in our humanness, in us being human. That's what incarnate is. Well, before we go, let me pray. Well, I hope this gives you hope. My gosh, if you just begin to practice these 5 things, even a little bit, if your life ends up being somewhat like mine, you'll just begin to transform. Let me say a prayer. God, I pray for all the perfectionists out there. They're exhausted. I get it. They've just been ruthless to themselves. So I pray that they would hear a new voice. Help them to reimagine a different kind of spirituality, not one that's focused on growth and becoming more and being godly and holy. All these theological words that just bring Christian spirituality down the road of perfectionism. Everything you stood against, you hide yourself in our imperfections. You hide yourself in our humanity. That's why you became incarnate like us. So isn't it very, very clever of you? So help us to practice acceptance. Help us to practice letting go of our critics. Help us to practice attuning to the now and accepting and making peace with the now. And help us to practice union with you, attuning to you. We don't have to practice growth. We don't have to practice memorization. We don't have to practice spiritual practices. We can practice waking up, attuning to you. And through that, Spirit, our hearts are transformed. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Sit there while I tell you just how beautiful you look tonight. As if you haven't heard me say about 100 times. You shake your head and look away. I promise that I've tried my hardest to let go of this, but every time I think about a world without you in it, my life becomes a darker shade of gray. Hey, hey, and all I wanna do is make you smile. When darkness still ensues, I wanna be alive. Whatever we go through, I'll make it worth your while. 'Cause every minute, every hour, every day, I wanna make you smile. Stand and keep on staring while I tell you that you're all I need. And even though I know you know letting be. I'm gonna keep on showing you exactly what